talk about relationship and that softer side of collaboration, I think I see a lot of people sometimes say like sort of like intake of breath, and because it sounds like they apply relationship and collaboration to like they would in their personal life with their friends and family, which is a lot of effort, right? And they're like, well, I've got thousands of suppliers. I think more for me, I don't know how you feel about this, but it's more about a good relationship is not necessarily the amount of time. It's about putting the right boundaries and trust in place from the start that says we are going to manage or collaborate in this amount, right, and this frequency, and this is what you can expect from me, and this is what I expect from you. And much like if you apply it to your personal life, you do that with everyone, right? With family, you do it more. People you see infrequently, you do it less. But at least there's that understood structure. I think a lot of I find with that vendor tail is I talk to customers which it's nothing or it's everything kind of thing. It's either I manage you or I don't, right? And it just seems that the opportunity is the ones that you don't, you can just give them a little bit more structure and information as to, you're not one of our biggest suppliers, but we will manage you in this context and this way, and I'm still here to have a relationship with. Do you agree with that or disagree? Or
I think the framework concept I completely agree with. That has to be in place, and the reason why I think that has to be in place is looping back to your soft relationship kind of comment is to me that you're talking a little bit there about almost like those personal relationships which are dependent on people. As we all know, people move on from organisations. Is that buyer-supplier relationship, partnership still there? So you can't really, as an organisation, rely on that completely. There's a risk there. So you need that framework in place to have that consistency and that standardisation that really surpasses just the are we friends as a buyer supplier on a personal level. So having that in place allows other people to walk in, or just the organisation in general, keep that communication flowing, that relationship going under what is kind of agreed terms. Now, how hard or soft those agreed terms are is a different matter for the contract.
Yeah, absolutely. That you're kind of sort of straying into policy, right? And how you set up that relationship, and I suppose it does lead into risk a bit somewhat, right? In terms of what is this person or this company doing for us? How risky is that? How much rigour do I need to wrap around that, right? I think it all has a bearing.
Completely. And so you then delve into the boundaries of where do us as a business, as a buyer, in terms of our policies, stray into what's written on a contract. I was talking to a customer in the field only last week where they were saying in part of their business, in certain regions and sectors, that they don't have everything in the contract. And in fact, the contract is only a few sides long for what could be or traditionally seen as complex IT services.
Yeah.
And what they rely on is a kind of mutual framework, predominantly agreed in principle, to ultimately work on problems together and solve those. If things are off track, then it can be steered on track, and people already appreciate and acknowledge that things may go off track, which allows you there
the
to
nature of
fix
IT,
it.
right?
Yeah,
IT doesn't exist if
completely.
everything worked all the time.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the other key aspect of the partnership angle is where does that boundary lie between what is my business and what is the supplier? And now we all know that outsourcing as a macro trend is extremely high at the moment. So the suppliers are, in effect, part of your business.
They're more of them,
part
right?
of the org.
Yeah, you devolved your four walls construct of your business, and the suppliers are now in, and it's less obvious where your business ends and your supplier stops, right?
Yeah, we have a customer that measures its supplier on to what degree do we have evidence that they look at our customers as their customers, not us who pays them, our customers. And that opens up some creativity in terms of here's how we can best serve your business as a supplier. There's a financial services company, and a supplier provides something that financial services company puts in the hands of their customers. Yeah. So they have somewhat of a user experience, a physical user experience as they use this thing. Yeah. So that supplier, like all of them, is measured on, do I think that supplier operates thinking of the customer experience to us, right? Yeah. So There are some stories of innovation. This is one thing, and especially through the vendor tail, where it's one reason it's so transactional and less than it could be, and values lost over time. How is that supplier that nobody talks to on any regular basis going to be incented and rewarded? Who's going to remember that they took the time to think up something extra and did something extra to the delight of the customer's customer? Well, in this organization, that's captured. That is scored and persists digitally forever. So we talk about trophies in the case. The supplier innovated, thought up something clever that would ultimately delight the customer of the customer and got credit, and the credit will persist. What we want to see is digital ways for that to happen far down into that vendor tail. And then talking as a small hypothetical supplier, if I but knew the roadmap of my customer, if I had a sense of their end customer and I'm doing something that's important, and if I knew that I bring forward new ideas and something new to consume and for them to use for the delight of their customer, and if they're going to remember that and credit for me and I'll get a trophy in the case, well, great. Then I bet they're going to partner with me when I come along later and say, man, those fuel costs just really made my price go up. Will you roll with it? Will you ride this out with me? Right? Yeah. So there's a lot of stories like that, but you're going to need some digital advantages, or you're just not going to, if you don't talk today doing it manually, where's the incentive? Is it even going to happen? So that's one of those challenges that we think is, if you have a value mindset and you really want to get across your whole supply chain, or as much of it as you possibly can, there's controlling risks, there's building in flexibilities, levers you can pull, like we talked about, and there's also incentivizing and tracking, rewarding innovation. And then that contract becomes more like Tony is talking about, like a birth certificate of a relationship that we're going to have for a good long while, hopefully. And it's not just a bunch of controls of a bunch of people looking to gain some transactional advantage and hold on to that in their tight little fists forever, right? We want it should be a birth certificate where in the end, it doesn't really matter what it is, because there's a great relationship and value exchange both ways.
Yep. So bringing us back, so we've gone off on a tangent, which is always good, right? I think the threads were there if we cared to unpick it and track back. But if we bring us back to kind of second conversation topic we had here, Deloitte wrote a really good paper recently, and for those who have cared to have read it, it was around the sort of disruption of upstream suppliers in Russia and Ukraine, and how that may further weaken sort of already global suppliers, right, and some of the crisis that they're in. And one thing that came out for me, I didn't even realise until reading this, was the amount of food agriculture, and like 25% of the world's wheat trade comes from there, and 60% of global sunflower oil, 30% of barley exports, all from that sort of Russian-Ukraine region. So that's a lot of stuff the layman didn't know come from there, right? We was always talking about the gas and the stuff and that impact, but it's wider than that, a lot wider. And Deloitte goes on to have sort of 12 suggestions around how you can deal with it. I'll go through the ones that I thought were the more important ones and the more relevant, and then I'll ask you guys to comment on them. The first one was like ensuring risk management frameworks and systems are in place, I thought a good one. Using technology to understand risks in tier 2 and beyond. There's two ways of looking at it, which is tier 2 in someone segmented their suppliers in really critical and important down to the vendor tail, the transactional ones, tier 2, or there's the tier 2, which is the second supplier in the supply chain behind your supplier, right? So there's two ways of looking at that. Understanding and activating alternate sources of supply, considering onshoring and friendshoring, as it were, which was Jesse, you touched on earlier, which I thought it's always that in-out, outsource, in-source, same thing, globalise, localise, globalise, localise. There's always a balance. There's always a swing to doing it. And also the further one which is becoming much more relevant, you see on the news now as well, which is increased focus on cybersecurity and risk monitoring, right? Within like your own company as well as your key suppliers, right? So out of the 12, I thought they were the 5 that sort of jumped out on me.
Yeah, so I think there's one general lesson there around visibility, clearly, and a need to get that visibility and insight right the way through the supply chain, and predominantly that starts by knowing your own supplier. There's another general one that we've kind of seen a lot recently, and it goes beyond the kind of conflict around cybersecurity. That's becoming an increasingly important risk domain, an aspect, arguably one of the most, and that I think stems from a lot of those services. A lot of IT services cannot be done in house; they have to be outsourced, and they have to be to lots of not only big IT outsourcers, which we know, but lots of, coming back to the kind of innovative, smaller IT services and solutions, which may carry more risk as well. So having a focus on the framework around cybersecurity risk is top of the agenda for everyone now. And those threat vectors can come from anywhere, right? It's global. It doesn't need a regional or local aspect to it.
I think it was the only one on there that we were talking about this morning, actually. So the cyber element is targeting suppliers and supply chains can typically, it has to be targeted towards you. And what I mean by that is there's this lateral sprawl kind of thing that tech is tech, right? And cyber, like malware, etc., doesn't differentiate between, it could be part of that geopolitical movement, but everything's connected to the internet. So you don't necessarily have to be targeted by it to then be impacted by it, back to the point of that lateral sprawl, right? So yeah, there's definitely a need to shore yourself up and your suppliers to make sure you can weather anything that might not be focused at you, but you're an unintended consequence of that focus, right? And that's evolving day to day, week to week. It's an industry all in its own right that I think you need to pay attention to.
So this is great. This is a recent one called the Supply Chain Implications of the Russia-Ukraine Conflict. And as you say, we think of the energy, the crude oil and the gas coming out of the region, and some of these important commodities that you had mentioned. One thing I didn't really appreciate was one of those commodities being neon, what you need to use lasers to make chips. And so we're still kind of in a chip shortage. There was has been one going on with great impact, not in this article, but elsewhere, mentioned that because of the pandemic and a huge demand for devices while people are locked down, that's impacting car manufacturers that can't build enough cars that you want to, and GM shutting factories down, in fact, because you just can't produce enough. You can't get enough chips in your hands. Even in spite of all these devices getting sold, Apple shipping 10 million fewer devices in 2021 than the year prior, and who knows what will happen this year.
Really?
And lo and behold, there's this neon coming out of Odessa and Ukraine, and Russia's also a major supplier. But when Crimea was annexed, a 600% spike in the cost of that stuff.
I didn't see that Apple quote.
Yeah, this was before any Ukraine anything. But
I was going to say, why? Do they know why that? What, just like saturated market, or what?
The availability of this resource was just more limited and in demand everywhere.
Okay.
So that they couldn't, I think I'm filling in a gap here, but just run enough manufacturing process, i.e. enough lasers etching chips.
Yep.
Because you need to use up neon to do that.
Yep.
And so it's not only neon, I suppose, but that was a big constraint.
Yeah.
And here's like one place of the world that supplies some 70% of it that exists.
Epitome of globalization.
Yeah.
Right?
We could be back here in a month talking about like a whole a real shortage now.
It sort of knocks into resilience, right? And
exactly.
the need to be,
Mm-hmm.
do you like multi-vendor, multi-supplier, multi-location? How much do you do to use?
The
stockpiling.
Stockpiling, just-in-time inventory is all the rage when everything's super stable, but you know, it's not so good when you can't fill your
you change your mind
at
quickly.
all.
Yeah.
So to your question about these recommendations, which still, I mean, you summarize 5. I think there's 1, there's 2, and then there's the rest. Number 1, and sometimes when you talk about this stuff, it feels like we're talking about the world's biggest companies with the most complicated supply chains. But for essentially any business, you got to have a framework. You are planning to fail. You may as well plan to get ransomware right now if you don't have a framework for managing your risk. And a framework is going to have this thing called appetite, right? Something could go wrong and manifest into an issue. How likely is it? How expensive is it? One in a very basic framework draws a line through that. And if it's above and to the right, we can't live with it. We have to do something to mitigate this. You could be a modest small business. It doesn't have all these levers to pull and friendly shores versus ons and offshores. But if you're in business, you pretty much want a framework, be it ever so humble, to capture and manage and, where merited, mitigate this stuff. Now you're in better control. Otherwise, today's day and age, Tony was talking about cybersecurity. You're just making a plan to have a big, expensive, surprising, problematic issue or many. And then so that was number one. Number two of the list is using technology to understand, get some transparency beyond that first tier. I would say yes. And it seems like the conversation often stops at transparency. Now I know. Well, there's knowing and then there's doing. And the very same people that want to know in our world are always telling us I don't have any more time to do. And if I go do this, I now can't do that, which I was doing. That was super important. So you need advantages. You need your technology, if it's well selected and built for you, is going to assist you in the doing, right? The knowing and the doing. Otherwise, it's just information and painful triaging that you'll have to do if you even use this information, right? So some digital advantages to doing more beyond these top few vendors where you may or may not have all these levers to pull. You're going to need some assistance doing and making smart, even machine generated or assisted decisions, and then executing, again, far down that vendor tail, since that's what we're kind of talking about today. I think those are the top things. Ukraine war, pandemic, whatever. Even without that stuff, that's still what's more and more we hear people demanding. And I suppose, let me say one last thing to make this point, bring it home. Now there's this war that focuses the attention and causes all this disruption. We have a customer, a different customer, that is illustrative of something. And in this one case, again, I have to anonymize here. They're a household name that provides certain retail products to the population. They have suppliers aplenty in the tens of thousands. And they made a decision to go from one shore where it looked like we had a big problem building and source from other things, sort of pre-built and pre-ready, contracts built, and draw down on those from other shores. And the example, I'm being a little general because I have to, but the motivating factor was Omicron, if you can believe. Like, now it seems quaint a little bit, and now that we see what's happening in the Ukraine and the atrocities and everything, and the impact to supply chain energy and all the rest of it out there. Now we know that Omicron is not so deadly as the Delta variant that came before, but at the time on one particular continent, a group of nations, it was spiking there. So this supplier, this customer, which had a lot of suppliers in that cluster of countries, made a sweeping decision, ramp those down to off, because here comes Omicron starting there, and we are going to source from these other shores. And so I guess the point is that transparency and that ability and that capability to make a decision and a change was very important to them at the time. Now there's more important things cooking, but these people in this business are going to always demand more transparency and more technology advantages to make sweeping changes like that based on market conditions. Sometimes they're kind of mild, like a flu-like symptom against which everyone's vaccinated now. Sometimes they're pretty major, like a flaming war going on. But if they don't have the latter, they're still going to want all that capability. And the other thing will be the big, giant problem of the day, because there's always going to be a big problem with the day, to your point earlier.
I think to unpack that, so I think that's a point well made, and what I take away from that and have done over the last few years in this industry is that everyone's looking for there's a compelling event, right?
Yeah.
But the whole thing is the fact of you need to be ready for a compelling event of all different shapes and sizes. You need to know enough about your suppliers and your vendors and your customers, if you're on the other side of the table, to at least know where you would go to have a conversation about X happening. And that X can be a pandemic. That X could be Brexit. That could be a conflict in Europe, right? And the point is you can't be too reliant on knowing what X is. You just need to have back to the framework,
well said, right.
back to the way you manage, back to the collaboration and the relationship, that you have enough of an established machine in place that's augmented by tools That means you can get across all of your suppliers in that way, from the biggest to the smallest, in whatever way that you can, be that digital or be that face-to-face.